Welcome to the 14 Wins podcast. This is Bones, and with us, of course, is Ram X.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. And what we're going to do today is going to talk about some news, government, and some stuff coming out of South America, and then we're going to go right into our interdimensional discussion. How's that sound?
Sounds good to me. I think we'll that interdimensional discussion could take 3 hours, but we'll try to wrap it up.
Right.
In like a half hour.
No kidding. Definitely.
So starting with the news, I think that the biggest thing that's happening in terms of the government and what's happening with David Grush and the recent revelations has been a big amount of attacks. There's been a lot, we talked about that. We've talked about that on previous podcasts. We were expecting this. Hopefully we prepared everyone. There were going to be a bunch of attacks. They're trying to attack Grush personally. They've tried to attack other whistleblowers personally. And they use their piss boys in the media, who I'm sure didn't want to start out being piss boys. I'm sure they wanted to be real journalists, but they ended up being, piss boys for government agents.
Right. Yep, it's very, very predictable.
Yeah, we're not even going to mention their names. It's not really worth it. Just that it was predictable. So we're seeing that happen, but we are seeing some things move forward. The Oversight Committee could really use the public's help. If you can reach out to your congressman, especially if you're in Kevin McCarthy or Congressman Comer's district, because they're the ones who can make the Oversight Committee form a select. And a select committee would have power, right, to go into like places like Eglin Air Force Base and say, show us what you got.
Right.
So it's really up to Congress whether or not that happens. It's really up to McCarthy and Comer whether that happens or not. And we're seeing a congressman or two show their colors and try to sound like they're against disclosure, like Congressman Mike Turner from Ohio. How could you be against disclosure?
So what's his argument then? I didn't hear that.
I think he's going with, we got more important things to worry about. I think Wright Patterson's Air Force Base is in his district, and he does have a bunch of lobbying money from there. But his opponent, fortunately, has grabbed onto it, right? He's like, I'm in favor of this UFO disclosure.
Okay. Right, good.
So we're seeing that happen. I think we said we would see UFOs on the ballot in 2024, and I have been told I'm crazy for saying that, but even from other UFO researchers. But I'm seeing it happen. Obama had a small video ad where he mentioned it. And just pushing the Democratic Party. So Democrats are trying to take, the credit here. Right? And we've got some Republicans who are pushing as well, like Burchett and Luna. So they can take advantage of this as well. And it's been advantageous to them, I think. The public in general is going to look kindly on UFO disclosure and look crossly on people who are against it.
Right. I think, especially after the testimony that was given out. Under oath, I always have to remind everyone, under oath, they gave this testimony, those pilots, about what they saw. So people aren't going to forget that.
No, I don't think people are going to forget that. And I don't think they're going to forget Grush's claims. Although right now, because it's been quiet, everything's in recess right now. People have had the opportunity. This is when, the intelligence community goes to their piss boys and makes their attacks. And so that's fine. I mean, we expected that to happen. This is part of Schopenhauer's stages of truth. First it's ridiculed, then it's attacked. Finally, it will be seen as inevitable, and these elections might make that happen.
Right. So there's also been some really interesting stuff coming out from South America. And in particular, Peru. What's your take on that?
Oh, yeah. So we've been talking about this. We've been talking about this for weeks now because we were a little late on this episode. But the this could be an entire episode at least. Let's talk about Peru. So it's a small remote village that's really far. It's like over 10 hours by boat from the nearest city in Ixtapa. So that I think that's significant to start, that it's rural and remote. Right. And that brings us to our first parallel to the Kentucky Goblins case, because I see a few here that I find interesting, whatever that ends up meaning.
Yeah.
So the remoteness and the situation that these people did have some cell phones. So there's been an effort to paint them as dumb, natives, but they did have cell phones, and some of them have now traveled to the Peruvian government and are speaking, and they're not dumb people.
Right.
They're, they're just close to the land.
Right.
So that's another parallel I see between the Kentucky Goblins case and this one. The same type of people, they were remote, which meant that they couldn't get in contact with government officials very quickly.
Right.
And then when they did get in contact with them, they didn't believe them very quickly. They were more likely to be seen as superstitious. And that brings us to another parallel between the Kentucky Goblins case and this one, because the Peruvian villagers saw this as being something from their folklore. Some of them saw this as being from their folklore. But the leaders of the village, and I think overall, they were thinking that they were extraterrestrial. So what makes this case even more interesting is that there's video and pictures from this event. And they look very authentic. So you can see something that looks like a 7 to 9 foot tall gray alien in one of the videos. You can see a light being around the same height in one of the other photos that's been taken. And then a girl has been injured. She's been lacerated. Something grabbed her from behind and lacerated.
Oh, wow. That I didn't hear.
So she said something white. She's 15 years old. Something, and one of these beings was behind her, grabbed her, and lacerated her throat.
Oh my God.
So there's been a mutilation attempt, and they call these things down there the pelecaras, which is face peelers. And they call them that because they find people with their faces peeled. And that's similar to cattle mutilations. Many cattle mutilation cases that are UFO related, they do find some of the face peeled away. Usually with the sex organs removed and other things too, but they specifically say for whatever reason it is, whatever is there seems to specifically focus on face peeling. And I think this becomes an important point that we'll eventually discuss in the interdimensional piece, where there's some locality to this. This has been happening there for decades or maybe centuries, maybe millennia, and in the same location, but it doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen at the same frequency or intensity. But right now, it's intense and frequent, and these people are getting video from it. They're getting attacked by this. So the Peruvian government had the military look into it. Some of the military came out with some ridiculous idea that this was gold miners with
jetpacks, right?
So they've been justifiably panned for that idea because, for one thing, these villagers are saying these beings are levitating off the ground, like several feet off the ground, and silently with something red on their feet. And so we're very familiar with jetpack technology. I really wanted to build a jetpack before I got into UFOs. And I got to tell you, all of them make noise. Yeah. All of them make a lot of noise. If you're talking about the quietest one, it's probably the ones that are based on drone technology. So it'd be as loud as a really large drone. Right. So there's no way this was a jetpack and silent. And then they were navigating underneath the canopy of the jungle. Right. And there's just no jetpacks that you can do that, manageably right now. And certainly not gold miners that were wearing armor, because there's another parallel between the Kentucky Goblins in this case, is that they were shooting at them and the villagers shot them, and they said that they thought they were wearing armor. Exactly what the men said in the Kentucky Goblins case. Right.
I think the Kentucky Goblins case, they depict the aliens as kind of doing some acrobatics too? It wasn't just levitating.
Yeah, good point. That's missing this time. And then the appearance of the creatures is different. But and this will fall into interdimensional as well, because the appearance is different. But look at how many parallels that we see here. And look at how similar the experience was, indicating that it's the same thing, taking a different appearance each time. Right. There's also an intensity, and there's also a level of malevolence that's much higher in this region. Right. And it doesn't seem to be as high in Kentucky. Why is that?
Yeah, good question. And then there's another case in Brazil, right? That's connected to some kind of violence too.
Right. So there's reports of UFO attacks happening in Brazil, and what's interesting is those are along a similar latitude. So if you went straight off to the coast of Brazil from, the area where Peru is being attacked, you'd be somewhere near where the UFOs were attacking people, or more closer. I mean, it's oddly similar considering how big the world is, right? These attacks, if you look at in the size of the world, they're happening in the same region. So the Peruvian government is taking it seriously. The Peruvian governor is taking it seriously. She has assigned a military task force to it. She says she's keeping an open mind as to what it is. Like I said, the villagers think that it was extraterrestrial. It was otherworldly.
Right.
And so our first thought is usually extraterrestrial, right? And then we get that mostly from the idea of fiction. And I think we derive a little bit of what we think of the interdimensional idea from fiction as well. So this is a big problem that Keel had, and I guess we'll start right off the bat by saying, well, let's address this. Let's evolve John Keel's work, because we're here and he's passed on. And he felt like he came up with this term ultra-terrestrial, which was sort of describing an entity from another dimension or another physical space. Right. And then similarly, I think Jacques Vallée has a TED Talk where he talks about how we should do away with the concept of dimensions, where, like, let's just get rid of it. We're saying there's 9 dimensions, and we're saying there's 12, and there's other people say it's 20. Like, what are we describing here? We can't travel them. We can't measure them. This is all ends up being theory, and we should do away with that concept. We're in this space. We're in this visible space of a narrow band of visible light that we can see, a narrow band of sound that we can hear, and then we call that material. We say whatever occupies that is material.
Right.
That's a false view of reality. That's not what really exists. Things can exist completely outside of your visible band of light. Wi-Fi does, Bluetooth does. It happens all the time, and they affect things in our material environment. So the idea of something being paraphysical or interdimensional is really just the idea that it has a much greater capability of matter and dimensionality than we do.
Right.
So, and let's stop there. And I think that's where Keel got into trouble, and he ultimately he said he failed with this ultra-terrestrial concept because people started naming them and coming up with ideas about who they were. And he's that you're missing the point. It's the capabilities. It's the scope. The ultra-terrestrial phenomenon is a scope, right? It's a shape. And what it indicates, I would pose a new definition, that what it indicates is the capabilities of this phenomenon. And regardless of where it's from and its original point of origin, even if they used to be human, what they're capable of now makes them ultra-terrestrial. So we're proposing something new here. That's the new definition, and I guess that's what we're gonna call interdimensional here, as we talk about this. So as we discussed before, we all start out thinking that this is extraterrestrial in the beginning, and what turns us away is the fact that there's a lack of consistency, for one, that would indicate that it's just one other physical species. And then there's a number of other things that we notice, and that a lot of people notice. You can notice from just looking at the Tic Tac encounter, the unusual flight patterns. So people describe it bouncing around in the sky, and I would say the most unusual thing about it is that it's not affected by the atmosphere. It's moving in way too straight a line, and that's one way we tell authentic UFO video is if it's not faked and it's just moving in way too straight a line, because any airplane is going to be bounced around or affected by the atmosphere.
Right.
And these things are moving through the atmosphere the same way that they're moving through the water. They're just not affected by it. So that indicates on some level that this might be a projection from another dimension or another physical space.
Right.
But it's not fully here. It travels around, and then when it needs to be, it's fully here. That could even indicate why we see two different types of propulsion. We see this thing moving around looking like it's not affected by atmosphere, and then we see it suddenly being something material and solid that is in the possession of the U.S. government. So how does that all work, right? So we know this phenomenon is not entirely of another dimension. We know that it at least can be fully three-dimensional and material. And that also brings us to why it can disappear and appear, because it's popping in and out of another dimension. We've talked about that. The invisibility and stealth could easily be accomplished by a species from another dimension or physical space, just popping in and out. And then there's the fact that we don't just see that with the physical craft, indicating that it's just a technology. There's also these things that we talk about that happen after UFO sightings that consistently. People describe something like poltergeist activity in their house, which is objects moved around, seeing weird shapes and weird entities in their house. This is describing something else. This is describing that they were almost infected with something else.
Right.
And I think we'll talk about the hitchhiker effect in the next episode, because it's a good follow-on to this. It's almost like they were infected with something like an interdimensional virus. We call it paranormal virus. And that seems paraphysical to me. You know, that seems ultra-terrestrial to me. Doesn't seem like something that's equally physical as us.
Right. So Keel talks about, that the spectrum, like you just mentioned, where there's a very narrow scope in the spectrum that we can experience. So yeah, if you're talking about them being infected by this alien occurrence, maybe for some reason their spectrum is just slightly been broadened.
Right. Exactly. Maybe
it doesn't have to be much. It could be just a tiny bit.
That's it. I mean, it could just be a little bit. We don't know. Consciousness gets mixed up in all this, and we don't know what consciousness is. We don't even know what it is. It could be another fundamental force. It sometimes seems like that. Even physicists are postulating that. And when we look at what's happening with quantum physics right now and the relationship between the observer and the observed, we're seeing that there's a reality shifts, right, based on perception.
Right.
So it's not out of the question that something figured that out. It's not out of the question that something has native capabilities in that space that we don't.
Right.
It's actually completely plausible, as plausible as it is that a species is from another planet.
Right. Or, they do operate on a different spectrum, and what we experience from them is just a slight overlap in our spectrums.
Absolutely. Maybe something there. It also ties into what we're talking about with this missing time, and altered perception of time that UFO experiencers and contactees have.
Yeah. So
there's a few things that happen sometimes during paranormal cases too, and sometimes during UFO cases as well. So the people talk about missing time, that they wake up in another location and it's a day later. And right. During the experience itself, people often describe a lack of sound. They describe a sense that something's completely different. Like they're in the same reality, but something's very different. One British researcher describes it as the Oz effect. I like that, the Oz effect, because all of a sudden anything becomes possible within this Oz effect. So it's like you're now in this being's reality. were you transported to a different location? Were you physically transported to somewhere else, another physical or paraphysical reality? Or is it masking that reality and then delivering those physical effects on you as well?
Right.
Either way, to the contactee or to the experiencer, it's as physical as anything else, both within the experience and within the physical effects afterwards. Certainly within the psychological effects, there's all these cases of abductions that I mentioned where they have exact same stories as someone who was physically abducted. It was someone with no history of delusion or psychiatric issues, and then all of a sudden they have this experience, and then they have the same symptoms of PTSD as someone who was physically abducted.
Right.
So that indicates that something, and I think that this is central to us understanding the phenomenon. And for me, I think it's central to finally understanding maybe how UFOs fly, which is, how can something be subjective and objective at the same time? And Vallée has all sorts of different frameworks for understanding this or, discussing it. But I think people get lost in that. He approaches it like a scientist. And, I think that they're not always the best at socializing ideas. I don't think we should go further than that. Subjective and objective. Like, how can something do both?
Right.
So that's all we need to understand. And that could be a technology. Like I said, we don't understand what consciousness is. We don't understand how gravity works. So let me create a technological scenario where you could create an Oz effect. You have a ray that affects consciousness and can create a directed experience. And you also have a vacuum, which we've seen around these objects. So you create a vacuum, and within that vacuum, you use this ray to affect this person's, sense of reality. So it all could be done with technology. But that's why we like this concept of ultra-terrestrial, because even if they're doing it with technology, bouncing around in time and creating alternate realities that can affect us in the same way that reality does, they've sort of transcended the basic concepts of extraterrestrial, crypto-terrestrial, or terrestrial.
Right.
So whatever this phenomenon is, it is ultra-terrestrial. Understanding that is something that we really want to share with you. Because hopefully what it gives you is a sense of what this phenomenon is capable of in terms of deception. It could be whatever. It can look like whatever. It can materialize whatever. So we just have to be careful as we move forward. I think we're going to see a bunch of people worshiping this.
Yeah.
We've already seen that happen. I mean, you could say that some of these contact events where people are out there and there's meditation events where they're all looking for a contact. You could say that that's almost a form of religious worship. It certainly looks like it.
Yeah, definitely.
So be careful, because you don't really know what you're going to get. And that's the other thing that points to something interdimensional or ultra-terrestrial here, is that the same people who encounter this energy are coming away with different experiences. And the experiences are as real to them as anything else. So a great example of that is perhaps the most well-documented UFO contact event of ever, which is the aerial school phenomenon. And there's tons of witnesses, right? Kids saw it, and then there were adults who had seen it previously in the area, and all of those kids are now adults, and many of them are still telling their stories. There's lots of documentaries about it.
Wasn't that the one from South Africa?
Yeah, and they had seen it in the area prior to them seeing it at the school. So when the kids encountered that, one of the things that cynics had pointed to, or skeptics even, I think it's a fair thing to point out, is that there's differences in the story. Some of the kids encountered different things. Some of them are describing different things. Some of them are describing beings differently. Most of them are describing the same thing, a craft with a couple of small beings. But some of them only saw one being, for example. And that's very similar to a bunch of other mass UFO contact events. So they're coming away with different experiences. And Vallée has this story that he likes to point to, which is there was two guys who were waiting on a bus, and I think it was in South America, and they had a UFO come along, and the one guy had sort of a UFO, was taken on board a ship and had a UFO abduction experience. The other guy said he got on a different bus down the road. So there was a different experience, and they both were somewhere else. And Keel talked about the living lights is the incident that he calls it, where he and a reporter were on a hill and he was making up his own language, and the lights were responding in it. So, something that can manipulate consciousness on that level, can it manipulate reality on a larger level? I don't know, but I think we need to understand the mechanism by which all of that is happening.
Right.
And that the first step towards doing that is acknowledging that this stuff happens, that the subjective part of this happens. People are encountering something that's physical, that's energy, that we can measure, but then the experience that comes away is different. And how much can we really measure that with our scientific tools?
That's super interesting. You can even relate that to just an individual's perception of color, right? Which is just reflected light.
Right.
But someone's interpretation of a red can be completely different than someone else's.
Great analogy, Bones.
Hey,
you've done it again. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Your perception is different. So you encountered this energy and you came away with a different experience. And people are trying to guess at whether or not it's based on your moral standing or maybe your mental state. Mental state, maybe. Moral standing, no. I mean, it seems to affect people from all walks of life, all types of behaviors. A 15-year-old girl in Peru, like, she was just out for a walk. Thing attacked her. And we have a bunch of cases like that, where when this thing attacks, it doesn't seem to care about who the person is as a person. So it's not that. How does it choose its targets, I think, is something that we should really understand. And then where does this frequency and intensity come from? And the Peru case is really interesting. And I want to tie this to the interdimensional discussion because it has a locality to it. It has a space-time locality to it, right? It keeps happening. That's what I mentioned. It keeps happening in that same area. But right now is frequency and intensity. The Mothman has been seen, 30 times in over the past 20 years in Chicago area. Like, the intensity is way higher right now. But there were some incidents before that, where it was being seen. The intensity and the frequency is way higher, and that's what we're noticing right now. So why? We need to understand it. And one other thing I want to point out in that Peruvian case is that the behavior that it exhibits down there, and we've seen this in a number of cases where people were either attacked or abducted, where it exhibits behavior that's more like a predator, like an animal predator. And even an overpowered animal predator, like a tiger, that would attack a group of gazelles. It could take each one of those gazelles down individually, but it attacks the weakest one, or it attacks one that has an injury, or one that is younger, or one that is older. It attacks something that's easy prey. And it tries to do so from a covert space, right? And it tries to do so from a space where it can get away real quick with a quick exit. And we see all of that type of behavior with this phenomenon. And especially with adolescents and even children, unfortunately. And down there, they know it. Like, down there in that area in Peru, they're like, this thing seems to go after adolescents.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that can also, we're talking about this, and we always have to slap the advanced label on this phenomenon, right? Like, they have to be completely technologically more advanced. What if their spectrum is just, I'm going back to that spectrum, is just wider, and they don't really realize that we're unaware, or we only see a real small portion of their activity.
Oh, that's interesting. They don't understand our limitations.
Right. That can go back. That could be tied into the crypto terrestrial discussion as well.
Right. That could be. And they also, I don't think that they understand I don't understand our limitations when it comes to technology.
Right.
When it comes to technology, I think the sky's the limit for us. And I think that maybe that brings on this intensity and frequency. It's not maybe a coincidence that this is happening as our AI is on breaking and on the verge of when we're getting ready to marry AI and quantum computing, which will take AI up, generative AI up 1,000 times from where it is today. And so we're getting ready to do that. We're making serious advances in cold fusion, where we could possibly do nuclear fusion at room temperature. There's so many different areas where we're advancing right now in so many different ways. So, that may bring on some intensity too. It may be perceiving a threat. Kirkpatrick said something that was kind of interesting at one of the earlier UFO hearings. He said, we see this activity being concentrated around the Middle East, the East Coast and West Coast of the United States, and the South China Sea. And you're like, oh, yeah, well, where are all of our military assets?
Right.
Where are our nuclear subs? Where are nukes? And these things, that many people have pointed out, many researchers and even the whistleblowers have pointed out that this phenomenon is attracted to nuclear technology and nuclear weapons, nuclear energy.
Right.
Which might point to something interdimensional or paraphysical too. And that could be why it hangs around at these spaces, and it could be why it's so worried about us and nukes, because whatever we do with nukes, a nuclear weapon lights up the electromagnetic spectrum like a Christmas tree.
Right.
All of the lights are on. So, if something's here with us, it could be really worried about nukes.
Right.
Remember when I said Mikhail Gorbachev said the Soviet premier walks around with nukes information and UAP information?
Right.
This is why it's advantageous that you and I, Bones, are idiots.
Right. Yeah, that's a good thing.
Because all those Stanford professors and all those Ivy League venture capitalists don't have the abilities that we do. See, we're so dumb, Bones, that we can say, why does he walk around with both?
Right.
Checkmate, old friend. Sorry, phenomenon. Wrong century.
Right.
Yeah, why does he walk around with both? It seems to me like those two things are related. And so there's a question mark as to whether or not we could detonate a nuclear weapon right now without this phenomenon either wiping us out, retaliating, or turning the weapon off.
Right.
It hasn't happened, right, since World War II.
And there's also the theory that that it might be the advanced radar that's messing with the the microwaves from advanced radar that could be attracting them as well, right? And that's why some of these pilots keep seeing them.
Are you trying to get us censored again? Are you trying to get us shut down? We all got the website censored. Are you going to get the podcast censored?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that when we talk about how to shoot UAP down, there's something mixed up there. And that's all we're going to say about that.
Yeah, right.
We already get in enough trouble. So anyway, to wrap up Interdimensional, it's huge. It's really where we end up. Even if we go through the extraterrestrial and the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis, we still end up here.
Yeah.
So let's not call it interdimensional. Let's call it ultra-terrestrial, this part of the hypothesis. And let's just accept that these things have these capabilities. And no matter where they're from, they have these capabilities. Because if they're from another dimension, they're not physical like us, So now we're dealing with something that you might as well call it an angel or a demon.
Right.
So let's bring this back, because even if they are non-corporeal, when they come here, they're operating on the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah.
We're operating with matter.
We're sharing space with them.
You're in Bones' house now.
Right.
So
yeah,
that means we can measure it. So this will lead right into the next episode where we're going to talk about the hitchhiker phenomenon.
Yeah,
where
great.
That's where why when you see a UFO do you go home and experience poltergeist activity and a bunch of other stuff that we're going to talk about, which will eventually lead into cryptids and the Mothman.
All right.
Forteans always bring it back to the Mothman.
Yeah, right. Always goes back to the Mothman.
All right, man. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone. And make sure to visit 14winds.com website.
Thanks for listening, everyone.